Testing before flying is likely to become a mainstay in how we travel, and especially when we go overseas. Tomorrow, Freedom Day, comes for international flying. And this week, I sat down with Qantas Chief Executive Alan Joyce. Alan Joyce, always good to chat to you. I just want to go with the international airline now reopening. It must be great just to see your people coming back on board. They've really had to struggle, as the airline has, over the past 18 months or so.
Yeah, Ross, I think that's the best news that we've had in 2 years, that all 22,000 of our employees get back to work in the first week of December. We've had to make the tough decisions of standing down 11,000 of those employees at the moment, 6,000 related to international, 5,000 to domestic with the close downs of New South Wales and Victoria. And those 6,000, most of them have been stood down since last March. So this is great news that they're all back working before Christmas. And we now have confidence with the light at the end of the tunnel that we won't need to stand people down in the future, given the really high vaccination levels that we now have in Australia.
And are you going to get them all back, or have some of them gone out and found other journeys? Because they're very innovative people, many of the people who have worked for Qantas, and they'd be in high demand, I would imagine.
They have been, and some of the feedback we've had from employers that have taken them in secondary employment has been amazing. You know, Woolworths took 5,000 of our people that worked there when they had a surge. But the feedback we're getting from the vast majority of employees, they want to come back. I ran into a load of them in restaurants, you know, working with Amazon, and people are saying they can't wait to get back on the aircraft and fly again. But one of the things that we see very clearly is that Qantas is a business that people want to work for. Before COVID, we were always in the 1, 2 or 3 of the most sought after companies to work for, and I've no doubt we'll get back to that post the pandemic, and we'll get back into a growth mode post the pandemic and can attract more people to our organisation.
And as the international borders reopen, what about the passengers? How keen are they going to be to get onto aircraft after having been locked up for such a long time?
Well, there's huge pent-up demand. You know, one of the stats that blew me away was the fact that 50% of Australians were either born overseas or have a relative overseas. I'm one of them. So I recently went to Boston, and I took the opportunity then to get to Ireland to give my mother a hug for the first time in 2 years. And there's so many Australians that tell us that story. And what we can see in our research that in 2022, that pent-up demand could be up to 3 times what a normal overseas travel for Australians are. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of visitors around the world that want to come into Australia, given how well we've handled the pandemic. This will be a tourist destination when the government decides to open her up. That will have amazing demand for it, and we're very excited about that.
And there's also the pent-up demand from those Australians overseas that want to get back into the country that now can do so much more easily.
Yes, and one of the things that we saw, we were planning on opening up, as you know, from the 18th of December, and when the government here announced that on the 1st of November we were going to open up, we brought flying forward. They filled up so fast, mainly southbound into Australia, from Los Angeles and London. We had to add 20 flights to London alone to meet the demand of just Australians trying to come home.
What about getting the aircraft? Now, those aircraft, some have been in the Mojave Desert and other places. Getting those aircraft back into service, can you do that quickly enough for that pent-up demand?
Yeah, so what we have been doing over the last year is a lot of flights on behalf of the Australian government to get freight out of the country and get freight in. And we've also been doing these repatriation flights. We've done over 200 of them on behalf of the government to places like India, Pakistan, to Europe, to North America. So we've actually been flying the 787s, which is the bulk of our long-haul international fleet, all the way through. So then we're never really stood down for too long. The big issue for us is getting the A380s back, 12 of which are in the Mojave Desert. We're bringing one back in before Christmas to get our pilots trained up on it. and we're bringing 5 back by October of next year, so that from Sydney to LA and Sydney to London, you're back on an A380. Now, I have to say, Ross, 3 months ago, though the plan was to keep them into the desert until the end of 23. We didn't think the demand would be there. We didn't think it would recover as fast. But we're that optimistic that we're bringing 5 of them back, half of the fleet back in 22, and we bring the rest of them back in 23. We think there'll be that much demand for those aircraft.
Do you think there'll be a lag, though, between the demand from the customer and the amount of capacity you can bring back in, other airlines can bring back into the Australian routes?
So we think domestically there won't be, because we're going to plan to get to 120% of our pre-COVID capacity here domestically.
120%. So in other words, you're going to have 20% more flights around Australia than what you had pre-COVID.
So we think there's, again, domestically, that big pent-up demand. The fact that our competitor went bankrupt during this period of time has shrunk in size. Tiger's disappeared from the market. We believe market share has and will move to Qantas Group, Jetstar and Qantas. So we're planning, by the time we get to April next year, that the group is roughly around 120% bigger than it was domestically than before COVID. And then internationally will take a bit longer, because not every country is fully vaccinated like we are. So we're thinking big growth to the US, to the UK, which that's why we're activating all of those aircraft. But the rest of the network will take a while to get there. So we're thinking by July next year, we're back to 60% of our capacity that we had pre-COVID. But most of the network, but with smaller aircraft. And then it will take to 23 for the full international capacity to get back to where it was pre-COVID.
This is the Qantas boardroom where you've made key decisions during this pandemic. I could even see, say, for example, you've been doing your own video conferencing. The interesting point is about work and whether that changes now as a result of all the video conferencing, the Zoom, the Teams, the Skype, whether that changes also the behaviour of business travellers on your airline. What's your own sense of it?
Yeah, well, we've done a lot of research on this, because we, again, have to plan our capacity based on what potential future changes in the market are going to be. And what we've discovered, Ross, is that domestically it's a bit different from internationally. And our domestic business is, again, a bit different from a lot of other airlines around the world. Amazingly, 60% of our traffic domestically for business in Australia is either construction, fly in, fly out, or government. And from our research, we don't see that shrinking because of the Zoom, the Microsoft Teams effect.
So is that actually a worker who physically has to go somewhere?
Spot on. Yeah. So if you rate that as actually a growing market, because what we can see in intra-WA and intra-Queensland is actually that's bigger than it was pre-COVID. So we think that 60% is not going to be impacted by it. The 40% will be, and some of the research says it could be for professional firms up to 30% of their travel gets an impact. But that relates to roughly between 10 and 15% of our total business traffic. Now, the other effect that I mentioned earlier is that we think we'll move market share from our competition, because they went bankrupt this year, and we're already seeing our model change and corporate market moving to Qantas. So we're thinking that impact is going to be smaller than that 10 to 15%. And we have compensated for that, because we have done a massive restructure of the business to take $1 billion on an ongoing basis out of our cost base to account for the fact that the business market is going to be a bit smaller, and that we have to adjust our size to be able to cope with that.
And internationally, that's where the bigger cost is, and that's potentially where the new technology is really giving a bit of a difference as compared with the face-to-face meetings.
Yeah, so interestingly on internationally, because the way we're coping with that, as I mentioned, we get back to over 60% of our network in capacity by the middle of next year. But we fly just about everywhere we flew before, places that we didn't fly before, but it is with smaller aircraft, the 787, which is a lot more efficient, has less business class seats on it compared to the A380. So again, we can adjust to that market getting a bit smaller. But amazingly, on international, the most of the travel, even in the premium cabins, is actually for leisure. So people will buy a business class ticket, a premium economy ticket, even a first class ticket, are buying it for leisure purposes. So again, we don't see that diminishing. If anything, we see that component of international travel growing in the next year or so when people go after those very important holidays they've missed out on in 2 years.
Part of the wealth effect, isn't it? House prices are up, people have got savings, people are going to spend those savings, so it's likely those premium seats are actually going to be in demand.
And I think you've been following it, Ross. A lot of people have seen other parts of the economy booming as a result of people not spending on holidays. And I think the pendulum will swing back the other way in the next year or two. Well, that spending will probably go back into holidays, even more so than it was before COVID, because people will want to catch up on that.
Okay, so let's here and now, as international borders reopen and you start flying internationally, the shape of Qantas itself. I mean, given the fact that you've taken on now $6 billion worth of debt, you've had to absorb it. Now, a lot of people look at JobKeeper and say, well, you got a lot of JobKeeper and a lot of support from the government. But the reality is that Qantas also took on significant amounts of debt to get itself through the pandemic period as well.
Yeah, we did. So there were three components that we did to get through COVID. We restructured ourselves, and unfortunately we had to make nearly 1/3 of our workforce redundant to give us a chance to recover post-COVID, to be able to repair the damage that COVID did. And we lost $20 billion and counting by the end of the year of revenue from COVID. 2 years in a row, over $2 billion worth of losses. So no company has been affected more by COVID than Qantas, I think, in Australia. So there's a lot of damage being done by it, and we have to repair it. So we did that thing first to restructure the business so it can produce the cash to pay back the debt. We did borrow money, $2.8 billion through this period of time. We did raise equity, nearly $1.4 billion of equity. And the government did help, but Ross, it was for our people, and it was to provide services to keep the economy going.
What was that, around $800 million or so?
Yeah, so of the $1.6 billion that the government gave, and over $800 million was for our people directly in JobKeeper or was through the assistance program. And they needed that to get through this. We had to stand them down. And I think the government did the right thing by them, because it was the government decision to protect the health, to close the borders down, that impacted these people's income. It wasn't their fault that they lost their income. And the government did the right thing by helping them through this.
But as these first international flights take off, there must be a sense of relief for your team, for your employees, for your management, for you personally, to actually see a sense of normal returning.
For the first time in 2 years, Ross, we have a relief. We see light at the end of the tunnel. You're having confidence the borders will open, but will stay open. Because all we saw in the last year and a half is borders did open, but then they closed down. I mean, we've gone through so many different versions of border restrictions. We're up to 406 versions of our border restrictions domestically document. That's how often they changed. But now we can see that confidence now coming in, that borders will open and they will stay open, because we're going to be one of the highest vaccinated countries in the world. And that gives our people confidence, us confidence, the market confidence, and our customers confidence, which is business is all about confidence, and everybody should get confidence out of where we are today.
Alan Joyce, always great to have a chat to you. Many thanks for your time.
Thanks, Ross. Appreciate it.